So today's lesson is on 6.5 standard components, and also we're going to fit into its 6.6, which is about layouts. So they're kind of very related. So we're going to talk about 6.5 and 6.6. So first off, components. So components are just all the basic building blocks of our program. Labels, buttons, text fields, text areas, checkboxes, sliders. They're all very similar. These are standard components, and a JPanel is also a component, by the way. But we've been customizing that, right? Every time we say public void paint component, that is overriding and creating a custom JPanel. Oftentimes, we don't have to do that, and we don't have to do that for JPanel either, oftentimes. But we're just going to go through some of their capabilities, what they look like. A few of the differences here. A JLabel is just a label. The user cannot edit it. All these guys are kind of what you'd expect, and I'll try to zip through and show some of the features. They all generate action events, just like timers. When you click a button, when you push enter on a text field or text area, when you submit the checkbox, that's all going to generate an action event. Okay, so you're going to have to catch those action events with the action performed listener. Now you might ask yourself, here's a good question. What if I'm clicking, I have 4 buttons here, right? All of them would generate action events. How would I know whether it's a plus, a minus, a times, or a divide? Right, since all J buttons generate these, how do you tell? There's actually 2 ways. So we can do e.getSource, which will return the object that generated the event, or we could do e.getActionCommand, which will give us a string, which is the label of the button or the text field or whatever. So we'll probably do this a little bit more, but just recognize the fact that you can either get the object with getSource or get the string with getActionCommand. All right, so briefly, I'm just going to zip through the longer notes here. All components are subclasses all J components are subclasses of component. Just like with the JPanel, because that's a component, we can get the width and get the height. We can do all kinds of things like this. So J buttons have constructors, and of course you have to register them like anything else. You have to add an action listener. Let's see, J labels, and for most of these too, when you pass in a default here, like the string, that'll be the label of it. Message.setText, when you want to change the text, we're going to use this later on, so just be aware of that, set text. There's checkboxes, text fields, and text areas. But I'm really going fast here because, you can see all these things here. I'm not really, you can look those up online if you really need them. It's really not, something you have to memorize. The one that is a little bit different is JSlider. And so JSliders do not generate action events. Every slide that you make is going to generate a change event instead. Okay, so change event. So you need to implement the change listener to do that. Okay, JSliders, when you create one, you can set the min, max, and value. You can do things like set orientation. And we're going to do a little practice this, setting the major tick spacing, minor tick spacing, things like that. That is a slider. And again, as I said, that generates a change event. All right, now when we do something like this, we're going to have a calculator here. How do we get it to look nice like this? How do we get it to have all these different rows, these 4 here? That bleeds right into 6.6, which is layout managers. So let's look at that real briefly. 6.6, layout managers. And we talked about this in the very beginning of the chapter, but there's kind of 3 main layouts that we're going to use in the beginning of the in this chapter, excuse me. So flow layout is the default, and the flow layout is you just keep adding until you can't anymore, and then you just go to the next row, and you just kind of keep adding until you can't anymore, just go that way. Right? Border layout, as we practiced, kind of creates this north, south, east, west, center divide, and you would just add it to border layout.center, border layout.east, or whatever. Grid layout allows us to divide it up into 2 by 3 or 4 by 5. You just specify in here the rows and the columns. Now, why do we care about layouts? It's because if you didn't, think about the difference between simple paint, how annoying that was. We didn't write it, the textbook author did, but simple paint, you had to specify all of the coordinates. And here we have it. This is simple paint. If you look at the paint component here, I have to calculate stuff like height minus 56 divided by 7 for all these guys. I'm drawing a border by hand with each pixel. I'm calculating, based off of this is 50 pixels wide, so on and so forth. What if I want to shrink it or grow it or so on and so forth? I mean, look at all this hard-coded information, right? So we don't want to do it that way, right? We want to have the Java handle that for us. So rather than computing coordinates, if we just have a container and we set the layout, right, the container would be often a JPanel or a JFrame. Now the syntax that we do here, let's say we have a layout set, okay, like grid layout or board layout. And then we want to add stuff, right? We're going to add stuff in order. It'd be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's always this syntax: container.add component, right? Container.add component, right? So this is the important syntax number 2, besides the listener syntax that I kept talking about. You can also add a border if you want. So you say, all right, this is the panel.setBorder. It's in it's a static method inside this border factory class. So border factory.create blah 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 border. Again, that'll help you instead of doing the borders by hand like the author did for Simple Paint. And so that's what we're going to talk about in 6.6. So briefly looking at those, I don't want to look at all these things here, but again, we have flow layout, right? It'll just keep adding it until you run out of space. Border layout lays it out like this, and then grid layout lays it out in a grid. You specify the rows and the columns. Border layouts, borders you can create again from this border factory. Here's some different ones pointed out. And so I briefly just wanted to point out again, here's this little calculator we'll talk about. But again, I wanted to point out that even if you have only one thing here, like you can add a bunch of things within this by putting a JPanel, right? So let's say I have this is a grid layout, let's say, and I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 rows and only 1 column. So it's a 4 by 1. And then inside I've got it a JPanel, but the JPanel itself, this is a J label, the X equals, and this is a J text field, right, in flow layout. This is another J label, and this is a J text field, and then the JPanel is contained in that. And then here, this is a JPanel, right, because you have to use the JPanel as a container. And to that JPanel, you add 1, 2, 3, 4 buttons in a grid layout, right? This is a 1 by 4, right, because you only have 1 row and 4 columns. And then finally, you just have a J label. So, you know, you're adding a container within a container for these guys. So just be aware of that. And again, the syntax was container.add component. So now I'd like to take a look at the actual Simple Calculator application. You can see you can type in stuff like 5 times 6 is 30, 5 plus 6 is 11. It'll just do it for you. So it's kind of cool. It displays it here. So let's take a look here. This is again an example where the JPanel is itself a listener, and he puts main inside here. We have some instance variables of some of these components, text fields and labels. And you can see we have a border set by the border factory, and you can see the J text field and so on and so forth. And again, I want to point out what we have here is this is a JPanel, and then inside we have a J label X equals and a J text field here. And notice we're using that syntax again. It's container.add component. I'm adding a J label to this JPanel container, right? Container.add component. Same thing here. And again, I said the third one is also a JPanel, right? So the JPanel is always used as a container. And then we put it in a grid layout, 1 by 4. If you try 4 by 1, you could see the difference if you try to switch that around. The buttons would be kind of weird looking like that, so 4 rows by 1 column. So let's go back to 1 by 4. But again, we see we have these buttons. We create the buttons, and we do this thing like container.add, and then the component, right? The container is this button panel here. And again, don't forget, once you create this JPanel container button panel, the button panel itself is going to have to be added. So don't forget about that, okay? So when you finish all of these guys, and then you're on this last one here, which is this just the J label here, don't forget, you are finishing now. I don't like it when he actually says it like this because it's like kind of confusing. I like to say this dot add, this dot add, this dot add. You don't have to because this can be implied. But again, I like to do it that way because that just reminds me, again, it follows the same syntax as everything else. It's container.add component. So we can see it. The container is this, right? I'm the kind of main thing here. And to that, I'm adding the X panel, that's this whole thing, the Y panel, this whole thing, the button panel, this whole thing, and then the answer. I guess it wasn't a panel because it wasn't combined with things. Okay, so that's the type of thing you'd have to do. Also, please note that in the button panel, these are actually going to do something, right? We want this to do something when we click it. So that's going to fire off action events. So we add an action listener. Again, this is also an action. It's listening on itself. That's why it's doing that, right? This is the component that generates the event, and then the listener. So plus, minus, times, divide. So we have to handle that, right? So we have action performed, and then it goes and just does its thing. So you can read through that, but that's kind of the main things here. And note the use of set text to change the JLabel. We're going to do that as well. All right, next up, slider demo. Just look at this real carefully, or not real carefully, really quickly, excuse me. So you can see here, same type of thing. We have a grid layout, again, 4 by 1. So we've got 4 rows, 1, 2, 3, 4 by 1 column. We've got a border, you can check that out. And again, sliders generate change events. So we have to have a change listener. So it appears that this guy is listening on itself. Yep, it's a change listener. Okay, so again, you can just see that there's several options that we have, such as major tick spacing, minor tick spacing. You can play around with those. And then again, state changed is the method that you would that would be called when the change event fires. We can also do set text on this label. So if we try to change this, we can set this text. And look, they use the get source. Get source, again, checks to see what is the object that generated that event, right? What is the object that fired that? Remember the two ones that you can do? We can say get source, which returns the object, or get action command, which returns the string. So next on the list, then, I want to apply our knowledge of components then and try to make SubKiller a little more interesting. So we'll do this in parts. So first, we'll just kind of create the components and not really hook them up to functionality. If you notice here, it doesn't actually change anything. And if I score here, nothing actually happened yet. But we'll work on that second. So first task, we want to create a little score panel underneath here. And so, again, if you ever want to pause it and try it on your own first and see if you can get that working, that would be great. But my hint would be, thinking about this, the whole game is like, it used to be just this area, right? But now we want it to be this thing. So we're going to have a J panel, which is going to be a container, contain this, right? Which is kind of like the game part, the game panel. And then this, which I guess I'll call score panel, right? So it's going to contain this, two things, game panel and score panel. So so this is how I kind of like to think about it, right? The whole thing is going to be some kind of J panel container. I don't know what the name is going to be. So this whole thing is like some J panel container, right? And then I'm going to add this and this. Maybe I'll have to do some kind of layout. This I've already done all the work for. And then this itself is going to have to be just another J panel because J panels are containers, right? I'm going to call this my score panel. And inside of that, there's going to be a bunch of different stuff. So hopefully you can figure out I've got things like labels and sliders. And then I've got this number here, which needs to be set as something as soon as I score. So this is the layout we're going to go with. And again, notice that even within other J panels, I've got different components inside. Okay, so let's try to create that. Okay, so first off, let's then modify. We have right now this content, but this is not enough anymore. We need to make kind of this whole thing here. So let's just create a generic J panel called container. Now, let's use a border layout here. We'll set this to be the center and this to be the south, okay? So let's try that first off. So let's have a JPanel, and we'll call it container. It's not a customized JPanel class. It's just a used as a container. And to this container, well, first let's container.set layout, and then we'll say new border layout is how you do it. New border layout. I probably have to import that. Import java.star. Okay. Now to that, I'm going to add these two guys. Now the thing is, I have not created my ScorePanel yet. So in fact, I guess I could write it and just have an error for now. So my SubKiller panel is there. The listener is set, and then I'll just call it ScorePanel. So why isn't this just a regular old JPanel, right? Well, sometimes you can get away with this just being a regular old JPanel, but just like this game panel, SubKiller panel guy here, we have custom things we want to draw on this. And for this one as well, we might want to provide custom methods, for example, to get the score be updated. And so probably a regular JPanel is not going to be have enough functionality. So we're going to extend JPanel and we'll call it ScorePanel. Okay, so let's call it ScorePanel, and I'll just call it ScorePanel. Okay, and it's going to complain because we haven't made that class yet. And then to container let's go ahead and add the content. And again, that's going to be at border layout dot center. And then to the container, we're going to add the score panel at border layout dot south. All right, so score panel obviously needs to be made, so let's go ahead and do that right now, but we're on our way. So let's make a score panel. Okay. So what does a score panel? Well, first off, a score panel needs to be a JPanel, otherwise it won't be able to contain anything. Okay, so what does a score panel have potentially? I would say that something that a score panel needs to keep track of is its state would be the score, right? It should know its own score. And so that's one thing that helps us, instead of just using our regular JPanel, if we have our own class, now we can keep track of the score. Okay. Also, in the constructor, we can go ahead and we can say, all right, this score panel should be looking like this. In fact, I'll just show this one. If I look carefully, though, I've actually got one. I could maybe call this two different main pieces. Okay, so I've got the slider portion and I've got the score portion. So I've got a container, and inside that container I'm potentially going to add other containers. Okay, so let's call this the difficulty part, and let's call this the score. So the outer container is the score panel. That's just this, right? I'm defining this, and then to that I'm going to have these two kind of sub-containers, difficulty and score. Okay, so because I've got two, let's just make this a grid layout. So I've got one row and two columns, right? One row, two columns. So I'm going to set this layout. This.set layout to be a new grid layout, 1 by 2. And let me just import javax dot swing dot star and java dot aught dot star. Okay, so now I've set up the grid layout. See if you can, on your own, pause the video, see if you can make it look like that. Okay, so I have got then let's see, I've got a JPanel. Let's call this the difficulty panel. Okay, it doesn't have to be customized because we're just using it as a container. Now note that difficulty panel is going to have to contain the difficulty, this label here, as well as the slider. And then the second one is just going to basically, actually I'm not even sure we need a JPanel container here because this will probably just be a J label. So this will just be, it doesn't need a JPanel. We can just have this be a J label because you can have a string and then this little variable here which you can set later on. So we'll have this be a JPanel, this be a J label. So difficulty panel is going to contain those two elements. So let's go ahead. So first off, it's going to contain a J label called, we'll call it difficulty label, new J label, and then the constructor will take in the label that you're going to give it, difficulty. And then it's going to also contain a slider, a J slider. Now, what do these guys mean in our constructor? Okay, so for the J slider, remember this is the minimum, the maximum, and then the value that's initially there. So let's have the minimum, let's make it a difficulty from 1 to 5, and let's make it start on 1. You can change that, of course, if you want. And then actually, let's just not add those yet. Okay, and so we've got those two elements, and so again, the main syntax is always going to be container.add component, right? Container.add component. So the container is the difficulty panel. To that difficulty panel, I'm going to add the difficulty label. And then I'm going to add the slider. Okay, and again, this was not in any type of a layout. This was in a just a regular flow layout. This layout is for this, which is the ScorePanel, which is the outer kind of thing here. So let's take a look. Does that show up? Oh wait, no, I think that's the wrong thing. Whoops. So it doesn't yet. Okay. So why, even after we did all this stuff, why aren't we showing up? I mean, if you look at the main, we've got ScorePanel being created here. We got it added to the container. It's kind of tricky. You have to do kind of debugging like this. I've got the difficulty panel created. All right, so I created this. If you think about it, that's all I've created. I have not actually added the difficulty panel to this outer score panel. Right, so what is this? How do I get reference this score panel? Well, I'm inside the score panel class. So I could just say this dot add. What am I going to add to the score panel? I am adding the difficulty panel. Okay, so now if we go to run it, let's see. Still doesn't work. So we have to continue doing some debugging here. Let's look. The hint is right here. We have created a SubKiller panel. That's the game part. Yep. We've got the listener. We created the score panel. We added to the outer container. This is the outer container. We added the content. So we added this piece here. Yep. We added this piece. Well, it doesn't have this part yet, but we added this piece to the container. Everything is good. Do you see it? Right. The hint is where I'm highlighting. It doesn't matter even if I've created all these things. Container is ready to go, but I have not set container as my content. So if I set container as my content, now finally I've got this. Okay. Now difficulty, the slider is kind of weird, so let's go ahead and add some of the slider options to make it a little bit more interesting. So we can do stuff like this. We can say slider dot set major tick spacing to be 2, and we can do set minor tick spacing to be 1. So that just makes it look a little bit nicer. Oh, no, sorry. We have to actually put the ticks on. So slider dot set paint ticks true. There we go. So we got the ticks. So every other one is ticked more. And then we can do things like slider dot set paint label. So it tells me what number it is. I'm not sure why, but these are all false by default. And then slider dot set snapped ticks, which will just make it so it doesn't get some weird kind of halfway spot. All right, and that looks good. Okay, so we've got our game panel and our score panel, and all we need now is to modify our score panel to not just have this, but we want to put the other part of that on there, which would be this J label, which contains our score. So let's go ahead and do that. So it doesn't have to be a J panel because it's only holding one thing. So we can just say something like J label, score label equals new J label. And again, the nice thing is we can set it to say score plus a variable. A J label can display the value of a variable, which is nice because that's what we want to do. Right, score is the instance variable at the top there. We can change that score as necessary. All right, so now we've got that created. The last thing is we need to add that. We need to add that to our outer J panel, right? This is the score panel, right? So I add not only the difficulty panel, but I add this score label as well. Okay. So once I've done that, let's check it out. All right, so everything looks good. There's no functionality yet, but we've got it set up nicely.